September 7th, 1940, 3:15 in the afternoon. The River Thames. Squadron leader Brian Lane stood on the grass airfield at Hornchurch, watching the eastern horizon darken, not with storm clouds, but with aircraft. Hundreds of them. The 25-year-old commander of No. 19 Squadron had scrambled his Spitfires a dozen times that week, but nothing had prepared him for what he was seeing now. "Good God," his wingman muttered through the radio static. "There must be 300 of them." Lane counted silently as the German formation grew larger. Heinkel 111s arranged in perfect V formations, each bomber surrounded by an escort of Messerschmitt 109s. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. 300 bombers, each carrying 2 tons of high explosives, heading straight for London. 600 tons of bombs about to fall on the British capital in a single afternoon. Behind Lane, the operations telephone was ringing constantly. Every squadron from No. 11 Group was scrambling. Every available fighter in southeast England was clawing for altitude. But the numbers told a grim story. The Royal Air Force had perhaps 200 fighters available that afternoon. The Luftwaffe had sent more than 600 aircraft. Reich Marshal Hermann Göring, commander of the German Air Force, had promised Adolf Hitler that Britain would be bombed into submission within weeks. The afternoon of September 7th was meant to be the beginning of that promise. Instead, it would mark the day when German certainty began crumbling into German doubt. What none of the Luftwaffe crews knew as they crossed the English coast was that they were flying into a killing field that would shatter Nazi air power and prove that industrial warfare favored the defender with production capacity over the attacker with tactical skill. The story of how Britain survived the Blitz and turned the skies over England into a graveyard for German ambitions is written in the wreckage of nearly 2,000 Luftwaffe aircraft, the courage of fewer than 3,000 RAF pilots, and the relentless mathematics of British aircraft production that replaced losses faster than Germany could inflict them. The German plan had seemed flawless on paper. After conquering France in 6 weeks during the summer of 1940, Hitler turned his attention across the English Channel. 21 miles of water separated German-occupied France from the white cliffs of Dover. 21 miles that might as well have been an ocean without air superiority. Reich Marshal Göring assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe could destroy the Royal Air Force in 4 days, 2 weeks at most. Then German troops could cross the Channel unopposed. Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain, depended entirely on controlling the skies. On August 13, 1940, the Germans launched what they called Adler Tag, Eagle Day, the start of the campaign to annihilate Fighter Command. Nearly 1,500 German aircraft crossed into British airspace. They targeted radar stations, airfields, and aircraft factories. The attack was meant to be overwhelming and decisive. Wing Commander Douglas Bader, the legless pilot who had fought his way back into the cockpit after losing both limbs in a pre-war crash, led No. 242 Squadron into combat that day. Years later, he recalled the shock of seeing the German formations. "They came in waves," Bader said in a 1958 interview. "Bombers at 15,000 feet, fighters above them at 20,000. The formations were tight, disciplined, professional. These weren't amateurs. These were the same crews who'd smashed Poland and France. They expected to smash us just as easily. But something unexpected happened during those first massive raids. The Germans discovered that destroying the RAF was harder than destroying the Polish or French air forces. Much harder. The reason was simple but profound. Britain had prepared for this moment for 3 years. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, commanding Fighter Command, had spent those 3 years building an integrated air defense system unlike anything the world had seen. Chain-home radar stations lined the British coast, detecting incoming raids while they were still over France. Observer Corps posts tracked aircraft once they crossed the coast. Operations rooms plotted every movement on large tables with colored markers. Sector controllers directed fighters to intercept positions with remarkable precision. The system meant RAF fighters didn't waste fuel on standing patrols. They scrambled only when raiders approached, conserving both aircraft and pilots. The Germans, meanwhile, burned fuel escorting bombers deep into England, leaving their fighters with barely 10 minutes over the combat area before they had to turn for home. Flight Lieutenant Bob Doe of No. 238 Squadron described the British advantage during a post-war interview. "We fought over our own territory," he explained. "If your aircraft was damaged, you could bail out and be back in the cockpit the next day. If a German bailed out, he spent the rest of the war in a prison camp. That psychological factor was enormous." The numbers from August 1940 reveal the brutal mathematics of attrition warfare. The Luftwaffe flew 32,000 sorties and lost over 300 aircraft destroyed, with hundreds more damaged. Fighter Command flew 21,000 sorties and lost just over 100 aircraft destroyed. The Germans were losing 3 aircraft for every RAF fighter shot down. More importantly, British aircraft production was accelerating. Lord Beaverbrook, the Canadian-born press baron appointed Minister of Aircraft Production in May 1940, had transformed British industry into a fighter-producing machine. His methods were unorthodox and sometimes ruthless, but they worked. Beaverbrook stripped bureaucracy from the production process. He offered cash bounties for aluminum scrap. He pushed factories to work around the clock. He prioritized fighter production above everything else, including bomber production. The results were staggering. In June 1940, British factories produced 466 aircraft. By September, they were producing 563 fighters and bombers monthly. Germany, meanwhile, was producing roughly 300 fighters per month. The Germans had started the battle with numerical superiority, but Britain was building fighters faster than Germany could destroy them. Every week that passed tilted the balance further in Britain's favor. Oberst Theo Osterkamp, commanding Jagdfliegerführer II, realized the problem by late August. He wrote in his diary, "We cannot sustain these losses. Every day we lose experienced crews. Every day the British seem to have more fighters than the day before. Where are they coming from?" The answer was coming from factories across Britain. The Supermarine Works at Southampton produced Spitfires. Castle Bromwich Aircraft Factory outside Birmingham was ramping up to produce Spitfires at an unprecedented rate. Hawker factories built Hurricanes. By September 1940, these factories were delivering fighters faster than the Luftwaffe could destroy them on the ground or shoot them down in combat. September 7th changed everything. That afternoon, when squadron leader Brian Lane watched the massive German formation approaching London, he was witnessing a fundamental shift in German strategy. A shift that would save Fighter Command and lose Germany the battle. For weeks, the Luftwaffe had focused on destroying RAF airfields and aircraft factories. The strategy was working. Fighter Command's bases in southeast England were being systematically destroyed. Runways were cratered. Hangars were burning. Communications were disrupted. Several squadrons had been forced to relocate to bases further north. Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, commanding No. 11 Group, which defended London and southeast England, was running out of operational airfields. His pilots were exhausted, flying 4 or 5 sorties daily. Losses were mounting. By early September, Fighter Command had lost nearly 300 aircraft in 2 weeks. Pilot losses were even more critical. Experienced flight leaders were being killed faster than they could be replaced. Park later admitted that Fighter Command was perhaps 1 week away from losing its ability to defend southeast England. "We were on the ropes," he said in a 1949 interview. "If the Germans had maintained pressure on our airfields for another fortnight, I'm not certain we could have continued." Then Hitler made his fatal decision. On September 5th, he ordered Göring to shift the Luftwaffe's focus from RAF airfields to London itself. The reason was part strategic, part revenge. RAF bombers had struck Berlin on August 25th in a raid that did minimal damage but enraged Hitler. The Führer demanded retaliation. London would burn. Göring welcomed the order. He believed the shift to bombing London would force Fighter Command to commit every available aircraft to defending the capital. The RAF would be destroyed in massive air battles over London. The strategy seemed sound. It was actually suicidal. By attacking London instead of continuing to pound RAF airfields, the Germans gave Fighter Command the breathing space it desperately needed. Damaged airfields could be repaired. Exhausted pilots could rest. New aircraft could be distributed to depleted squadrons. The pressure that had been pushing Fighter Command toward breaking point suddenly eased. More critically, the Germans were now flying deeper into England than ever before. London was 60 miles from the French coast. German bombers had to fly 120 miles round trip, much of it over hostile territory. German fighters with limited fuel capacity could spend barely 10 minutes over London before they had to turn back. The escort fighters that were supposed to protect the bombers were reduced to flying close formation, unable to engage RAF fighters effectively. Squadron leader Douglas Bader immediately recognized the German error. When they started coming for London, he recalled, "We knew we'd won. They had to fly deep into our airspace, which meant we could hit them with fresh squadrons all the way in and all the way out. Their fighters were tied to the bombers, which made them sitting ducks." The afternoon of September 7th saw the largest daylight raid of the entire battle. The German formation that Brian Lane watched approaching consisted of 348 bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, nearly 1,000 aircraft darkening the sky, but Fighter Command had 21 squadrons airborne to meet them. The British fighters tore into the German formations over the Thames estuary. Spitfires engaged the Messerschmitt escorts at high altitude while Hurricanes attacked the bomber formations. The sky became a swirling chaos of aircraft, tracer fire, and falling debris. Pilot Officer Jeffrey Page of No. 56 Squadron was shot down that afternoon when his Hurricane caught fire. He bailed out with severe burns that required years of surgery to repair. But in his post-war memoir, he recalled the determination of RAF pilots that day. "We knew they were going for London," Page wrote. "Our families were down there, our homes, everything we were fighting for. There was no question of holding back or preserving ourselves. We went straight into them." The Germans dropped 650 tons of high explosive and thousands of incendiary bombs on London that afternoon and evening. The fires could be seen from France. 9 East End districts were burning simultaneously. 448 civilians died. Over 1,600 were seriously injured. The damage was catastrophic, but the RAF had won the air battle. Fighter Command claimed 99 German aircraft destroyed that day. The actual number was probably closer to 40 destroyed, with many more damaged, but the psychological impact on German crews was profound. They had been promised air superiority. Instead, they'd been mauled by RAF fighters that were supposed to be on the verge of collapse. Unteroffizier Wilhelm Bauer, a Heinkel 111 gunner with Kampfgeschwader 5-3, wrote in his diary that night, "The English fighters were everywhere. We lost 3 aircraft from our formation. The fighter escort vanished when we were still 20 miles from London. We were alone over the city, and the Spitfires came for us like sharks. How can we win this?" For the next 57 consecutive nights, German bombers returned to London. The Blitz had begun in earnest. Every evening, as darkness fell, the air raid sirens wailed across the capital. Every night, hundreds of German bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries on the city. The civilian toll was horrific. By the end of 1940, over 13,000 Londoners had been killed. Nearly 20,000 were seriously injured. Entire neighborhoods were reduced to rubble. The docks were repeatedly hit, causing massive fires. Railways were disrupted. Power stations were damaged. Water mains were severed. But London did not break. The British spirit proved more resilient than German bombs. Factory workers who spent nights in shelters returned to their jobs each morning. Women joined fire brigades and ambulance services. Children were evacuated to the countryside. Life continued with a stubborn determination that baffled German planners. King George VI and Queen Elizabeth refused to leave London, remaining in Buckingham Palace throughout the Blitz. When the palace was hit by German bombs on September 13th, the Queen famously remarked, "I'm glad we've been bombed. It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." The nighttime bombing campaign actually helped Fighter Command more than it hurt it. German bombers flying at night couldn't achieve the accuracy needed to destroy specific targets like aircraft factories or airfields. They dropped their bombs across wide areas, causing civilian casualties, but doing little damage to Britain's war-making capacity. Meanwhile, British aircraft production continued accelerating. The Castle Bromwich factory, which had struggled to produce Spitfires before the war, was now completing 1 aircraft every 4 hours. By October 1940, British factories were producing over 500 fighters monthly, while German factories produced about 300. The disparity wasn't just in numbers. British fighters were also improving in quality. The Spitfire Mark II entered service in August with a more powerful Merlin engine producing 1,200 horsepower compared to 1,050 horsepower in the Mark I. The new variant was 15 miles per hour faster and climbed better at all altitudes. The Hurricane, while slower than both the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt 109, proved an excellent bomber-destroyer. Its 8 .303 caliber machine guns could shred a bomber's aluminum skin in seconds. Hurricane squadrons developed tactics specifically for attacking bomber formations, leaving the Spitfires to engage German fighter escorts. Flight Lieutenant James Nicholson of No. 249 Squadron became the only fighter command pilot to win the Victoria Cross during the Battle of Britain. On August 16th, his Hurricane was hit by German cannon fire that set the aircraft ablaze and wounded him in the foot and eye. Instead of bailing out immediately, Nicholson remained in the burning cockpit long enough to shoot down the Messerschmitt 110 that had attacked him. Only then did he parachute to safety, suffering severe burns. His citation read, "Flight Lieutenant Nicholson's actions demonstrated extraordinary courage and devotion to duty. Though wounded and with his aircraft on fire, he remained at his post to destroy the enemy before saving himself. Such determination was characteristic of fighter command throughout the battle. The pilots were exhausted, outnumbered, and facing an enemy with more combat experience. Yet they refused to yield. By mid-September, the Germans realized their strategy wasn't working. London was burning, but Britain showed no sign of seeking peace terms. Fighter command was still operational and still inflicting unacceptable losses. The invasion of Britain, scheduled for September 15th, was looking increasingly impossible. September 15th became known as Battle of Britain Day, the date when Germany made its final attempt to destroy fighter command in preparation for invasion. The Luftwaffe launched 2 massive raids that day, throwing over 400 bombers and 600 fighters against London. Fighter command met them with every available squadron. Over 25 squadrons were airborne during the morning raid alone. The German formations were attacked repeatedly from the coast, all the way to London and all the way back. The fighting was savage. Wing Commander Douglas Bader's Big Wing formation, 5 squadrons flying together, intercepted the second German raid over London. 60 RAF fighters smashed into the German formation, scattering bombers across the sky. German formations that had maintained tight discipline on every previous raid broke apart under the sustained British attack. The Germans claimed they shot down 79 RAF fighters that day. The actual British loss was 26 aircraft with 13 pilots killed. The RAF claimed 185 German aircraft destroyed. The true German loss was probably around 60 aircraft destroyed with many more damaged, but the perception mattered more than the reality. German crews reported being attacked by overwhelming numbers of British fighters. They reported formations breaking up under sustained attack. They reported heavy losses. The myth of RAF collapse evaporated that afternoon. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. The invasion of Britain would not happen in 1940, perhaps not ever. The Luftwaffe had failed to destroy fighter command. Without air superiority, a channel crossing would be suicide. October 1940 brought a shift in German tactics. The massive daylight raids ended. The Luftwaffe couldn't sustain the losses. Instead, the Germans focused on nighttime bombing and fighter-bomber raids, where a single Messerschmitt 109 carried a single 500-pound bomb on a high-speed dash across the channel. These fighter-bomber raids were difficult to intercept, but caused minimal damage. A single bomb couldn't destroy much, and the bomb load reduced the Messerschmitt's performance enough that RAF fighters could catch them. The tactic achieved little except keeping German fighter pilots flying combat missions that had questionable value. The statistics from September and October 1940 tell the story of German failure. In September, the Luftwaffe lost 380 aircraft destroyed, with hundreds more damaged. Fighter Command lost 178 aircraft destroyed, but lost only 142 pilots killed or missing. The difference was crucial. Aircraft could be replaced in weeks. Pilots took months to train. By November, British pilot strength had actually increased since August. The training pipeline established before the war was now delivering trained pilots faster than losses occurred. Commonwealth volunteers from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa were arriving in increasing numbers. Polish and Czech pilots who'd escaped their occupied countries fought with ferocious determination. The Polish squadrons, number 302 and 303, achieved some of the highest kill ratios in fighter command. The Polish pilots had additional motivation. Germany had conquered their homeland. They fought with a personal hatred that made them particularly deadly. Flight Lieutenant Jan Zumbash of number 303 Squadron was credited with destroying 13 German aircraft during the battle. In his memoir, he explained Polish fighting spirit. "We had lost everything. Our country, our families, our homes. The only thing we had left was the chance to kill Germans. We took that chance every time we flew." The German fighter pilots were reaching their breaking point. They'd been flying combat missions continuously since the battle began in July. Losses were mounting. Replacement pilots arrived with minimal training. The quality of Luftwaffe fighter units was declining, while the quality of RAF squadrons improved. Major Adolf Galland, commanding officer of Jagdgeschwader 26 and one of Germany's top aces, met with Göring in mid-September. The Reich Marshal asked what Galland needed to win the battle. Galland's response became famous. "I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my squadron." The remark, meant partly in jest, revealed deep frustration. German pilots had been told the Spitfire was inferior to the Messerschmitt 109. They'd discovered that wasn't true. The Spitfire was slower in a dive and had less firepower, but it could outturn the Messerschmitt, climb faster, and perform better at high altitude. More importantly, British pilots were fighting over their own territory, with ground controllers directing them to intercept positions. German pilots flew deep into enemy airspace with limited fuel and no ground control. If they were shot down, they became prisoners. If their aircraft was damaged, they had to nurse it back across the channel or ditch in the sea. Oberleutnant Julius Neumann, who flew with Jagdgeschwader 27 during the battle, was shot down over Kent in early September. He parachuted safely and was captured by British Home Guard. In post-war interviews, he recalled his realization during that parachute descent. "I understood as I floated down that Germany had already lost," Neumann said. "Not the battle perhaps, but the war. We couldn't replace our losses fast enough. Every pilot captured was a pilot lost forever. The British could lose pilots and aircraft and simply make more. We were fighting an enemy with infinite resources. How do you defeat that?" By late October, the Luftwaffe had effectively abandoned daytime operations over Britain except for fighter-bomber raids and high-altitude reconnaissance flights. The night bombing continued, but it achieved nothing strategically significant. British industry continued producing aircraft, tanks, and weapons. British ports remained open. British morale held firm. The statistics revealed German failure completely. From July 10th through October 31st, 1940, the Luftwaffe lost 1,777 aircraft destroyed, with nearly 2,000 more damaged. Fighter Command lost 1,044 aircraft destroyed, with 544 pilots killed. Britain had won the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. The human cost of the Battle of Britain extended far beyond casualty lists. Every pilot who flew combat during those desperate months carried scars, visible and invisible, for the rest of their lives. Jeffrey Page, the pilot who bailed out of his burning Hurricane on September 7th, spent 2 years in hospital undergoing reconstructive surgery. He returned to combat flying in 1943 with a face rebuilt by pioneering plastic surgeon Archibald McIndoe. Page flew throughout the rest of the war and survived, but he never forgot the afternoon his Hurricane caught fire. "The pain was unimaginable," he wrote decades later. "The cockpit was an inferno. My hands were burning. My face was burning. But I knew if I didn't shoot down that Messerschmitt first, he'd kill someone else. That's what kept me in the seat those extra seconds." Wing Commander Tom Neal of No. 249 Squadron flew combat throughout the battle and survived to become one of the RAF's most successful fighter pilots with 14 confirmed victories. In his memoir, he described the psychological toll. "You'd wake each morning wondering if this would be your last day," Neal wrote. "You'd see empty chairs at breakfast where friends had sat yesterday. You'd climb into your aircraft knowing the odds were against you surviving the week. The stress was crushing. Some pilots broke down. Others drank heavily. We all found ways to cope with knowing we might be dead by evening. The ground crews deserve equal recognition. These were the mechanics, armorers, and riggers who kept aircraft flying despite exhaustion, fear, and inadequate facilities. Many airfields were bombed repeatedly. Ground crew worked through air raids to repair damaged aircraft and prepare them for the next sortie. Sergeant James Corbin, a fitter with No. 43 Squadron, recalled the pressure in a 1985 interview. "The pilots got the glory, and they deserved it, but we knew their lives depended on our work. If we missed something, if we made a mistake, men died. That responsibility weighed on us every minute of every day." The women of Britain played crucial roles throughout the battle. The Women's Auxiliary Air Force staffed operations rooms, plotted raids, and kept the air defense system functioning. Women worked in aircraft factories producing fighters. They drove ambulances and fire engines during the Blitz. They maintained morale on the home front while their men fought and died in the skies above. The Observer Corps, composed largely of volunteers too old for military service, stood watch throughout southern England, identifying aircraft types and tracking their movements. These men and women manned observation posts through every air raid, often exposed to enemy fire, ensuring that operations rooms received accurate information. Churchill's famous speech on August 20th captured the nation's gratitude. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. The few became the collective name for fighter command pilots who flew during the battle. The Air Ministry later defined the few as all air crew who flew at least one operational sortie with fighter command between July 10th and October 31st, 1940. The total number of the few was 2,937 pilots from 15 nations. Britain provided 2,353 pilots. Poland provided 145, New Zealand 127, Canada 112, Czechoslovakia 88, Australia 32, South Africa 25. Others came from Belgium, France, Ireland, and even the United States, though America wasn't yet in the war. 544 of the few died during the battle. Many more died later in the war. Of the 2,937, fewer than half survived to see victory in 1945. Squadron leader Brian Lane, who watched the massive German formation approaching on September 7th, survived the Battle of Britain only to be killed in December 1942 during a sweep over France. He was 27 years old. His body was never recovered. Wing Commander Douglas Bader survived the Battle of Britain but was shot down over France in August 1941. He spent the rest of the war in German prisoner camps, repeatedly attempting escape despite having no legs. He survived and became one of Britain's most celebrated war heroes. Jeffrey Page flew combat throughout the war despite his injuries. He survived and lived until 2008, one of the last of the few. He spent his final decades ensuring that the Battle of Britain would never be forgotten, speaking at schools and ceremonies about the price of freedom. The Battle of Britain was ultimately decided by industrial capacity and logistics, rather than tactical brilliance or individual courage. Britain won because it could produce fighters faster than Germany could destroy them and train pilots faster than they were killed. Lord Beaverbrook's ruthless drive to maximize fighter production saved Britain as surely as the skill of RAF pilots. Under his leadership, British factories delivered 4,833 aircraft between July and October 1940. This included 2,247 fighters. During the same period, German factories produced approximately 2,123 aircraft total, with about 900 fighters. Britain wasn't just producing more aircraft. British factories were also producing better aircraft. The Spitfire Mark II and Hurricane Mark II entering service by late 1940 were superior to their predecessors in every way. Meanwhile, the Messerschmitt 109E, which equipped most German fighter units, hadn't significantly improved since the battle began. The integrated air defense system gave Britain another crucial advantage. German bombers never achieved surprise after the first few raids. Chain-home radar detected them forming up over France. Observer Corps tracked them across southern England. Sector controllers directed fighters to intercept positions with remarkable accuracy. This system meant RAF fighters were always in the right place at the right time. German pilots reported being attacked by overwhelming numbers of British fighters. The reality was that fighter command rarely committed more than 20 or 30 fighters to any single interception. But those 20 or 30 fighters appeared exactly where they needed to be, creating the impression of much larger forces. German intelligence consistently overestimated RAF strength and underestimated British aircraft production. By late September, Luftwaffe headquarters believed Fighter Command was down to fewer than 200 operational fighters. The actual number was over 600. This intelligence failure led to continued German attacks against an enemy they thought was on the verge of collapse, when, in fact, Fighter Command was growing stronger daily. The location of the battle favored Britain as well. Fighting over southern England meant downed RAF pilots could be rescued and returned to combat within hours. Flight Lieutenant Eric Nicholson, badly burned when his Hurricane caught fire, bailed out over Southampton. Civilians rescued him and rushed him to hospital. He was back on operations within weeks. German pilots who bailed out over England spent the rest of the war in prison camps. Experienced pilots were irreplaceable assets. Losing them to capture hurt Germany as much as losing them to death. The fuel situation also favored Britain. RAF fighters flew from bases in southern England, typically 10 to 15 minutes from combat zones. They could fly multiple sorties daily because they weren't burning fuel on long transits. German fighters flying from bases in France and Belgium spent much of their fuel just reaching the combat area. They typically had 10 minutes of combat time before fuel levels forced them to turn back. This meant German fighters were always at a disadvantage. They entered combat with half-empty tanks. They couldn't pursue damaged RAF fighters. They couldn't provide continuous escort for bomber formations. RAF fighters operating close to their bases could pursue German aircraft far out over the channel, knowing they had ample fuel to return home. The pilot training disparity grew throughout the battle. British pilot training took 6 months and included over 200 hours of flying time. Pilots arrived at squadrons with solid fundamental skills. German pilot training, already compressed before the war, was shortened further as the Luftwaffe struggled to replace losses. By late 1940, German replacement pilots arrived at squadrons with barely 100 hours total flying time and minimal combat training. This quality gap showed in combat results. Experienced RAF pilots consistently shot down multiple German aircraft. Squadron leader Bob Stanford Tuck of No. 257 Squadron destroyed 29 German aircraft during his career, many during the Battle of Britain. His success came from training, experience, and fighting over home territory, where fuel and ammunition weren't constant concerns. The radar system deserves special attention. Chain home stations could detect aircraft formations at ranges exceeding 100 miles. This early warning gave Fighter Command 30 minutes or more to scramble fighters and position them for interception. German raids never achieved tactical surprise after the first week of combat. The system wasn't perfect. Radar couldn't determine aircraft altitude accurately. It couldn't distinguish between friendly and enemy aircraft. The Observer Corps filled these gaps using trained spotters with binoculars and telephone links to operations rooms. The combination of radar and visual observation created an air defense network that kept Fighter Command consistently informed about raid strength, composition, and location. German intelligence never fully understood the system. They bombed radar stations repeatedly, but underestimated their importance. They never realized that destroying radar would blind Fighter Command more effectively than shooting down fighters. By the time German planners recognized radar's critical role, the battle was already lost. The failed Battle of Britain changed the trajectory of World War II fundamentally. Germany lost its chance to invade Britain and eliminate its last major enemy in Western Europe. The Luftwaffe was permanently weakened, never again able to achieve the numerical superiority it possessed in summer 1940. More importantly, Britain remained an unsinkable aircraft carrier off the coast of occupied Europe. American forces would later use Britain as the staging ground for the liberation of France. The strategic bombing campaign against Germany was launched from British bases. The victory in the Battle of Britain made all subsequent Allied victories possible. German losses were staggering and irreplaceable. The Luftwaffe lost not just aircraft, but experienced crews. The bomber units that attacked Britain in summer 1940 were the same units that had conquered Poland and France. By winter 1940, those units were shadows of their former strength, filled with replacement crews who had minimal training. The psychological impact on Germany was severe. The Luftwaffe had been portrayed as invincible. The failure over Britain shattered that myth. German morale, both military and civilian, suffered. If the mighty Luftwaffe couldn't defeat tiny Britain, how could Germany win the war? Conversely, British morale soared. The nation had stood alone against Nazi Germany and survived. Churchill's speeches during the battle became legendary, capturing British determination. "We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." The Battle of Britain validated Churchill's strategy of refusing Hitler's peace offers. Germany had offered peace terms in July 1940. Britain would keep its empire. Germany would control Europe. Churchill rejected the offer, insisting that Britain would fight on until Germany was defeated. The victory in the Battle of Britain proved that Churchill's defiance had been justified. American public opinion shifted dramatically. The United States was officially neutral in 1940, but many Americans viewed Britain as doomed. The British victory changed that perception. If tiny Britain could defeat Germany, perhaps Germany wasn't invincible after all. American support for Britain increased, paving the way for Lend-Lease and eventual American entry into the war. The battle established the Spitfire as an icon. The aircraft became synonymous with British resistance. Its distinctive elliptical wings and Merlin engine's roar were symbols of defiance. Pilots who flew Spitfires during the Battle of Britain became national heroes. The aircraft itself became Britain's most famous weapon. Reginald Mitchell, the Spitfire's designer, had died in 1937, never knowing his creation would save Britain. The aircraft he designed as a racing plane adapted for military use became the symbol of British resistance. Mitchell's widow later said he would have been proud, but also typically modest about his achievement. The Hurricane deserves equal recognition, but never achieved the Spitfire's fame. More Hurricanes than Spitfires fought in the Battle of Britain. Hurricane pilots claimed more German aircraft destroyed than Spitfire pilots. The Hurricane was easier to build, easier to maintain, and could operate from rough fields. It was the workhorse of fighter command, while the Spitfire got the glory. The battle also validated strategic bombing theory, though not in the way pre-war theorists expected. The Germans had believed bombing would break civilian morale and force surrender. Instead, bombing stiffened resistance. Londoners emerged from shelters each morning more determined than ever. The Blitz failed because people proved more resilient than bombs. This lesson would be learned again and again throughout the war. Strategic bombing of civilians never achieved the decisive results predicted by theorists. German civilian morale held through years of Allied bombing. British civilian morale held through the Blitz. Japanese civilian morale held until the atomic bombs. The Battle of Britain was the first proof that bombing alone couldn't win wars. The night defense problem remained unsolved throughout the Blitz. RAF night fighters struggled to intercept German bombers in the darkness. Early airborne radar was primitive and unreliable. German bombers flew with relative impunity at night, dropping bombs by dead-reckoning navigation that often missed intended targets by miles. The development of effective night fighting would take years. The Bristol Bow fighter with improved radar eventually gave the RAF a capable night fighter, but during the Blitz, German bombers faced minimal opposition after dark. The night bombing caused tremendous civilian suffering, but achieved little strategic effect. Cities beyond London suffered as well. Coventry was devastated in November 1940 when over 500 German bombers destroyed the medieval city center and killed nearly 600 civilians. The raid introduced a new German term. Coventrieren meant to utterly destroy through bombing. Birmingham, Liverpool, Southampton, Plymouth, and Bristol all endured heavy raids. But British industry kept producing. Factories moved underground or dispersed to smaller facilities. Production actually increased during the Blitz. British determination to continue fighting grew stronger with each raid. Hitler's strategy of bombing Britain into submission had the opposite effect, hardening British resolve to fight until victory. On October 31, 1940, the Air Ministry formally declared the Battle of Britain over. The date was somewhat arbitrary. German raids continued throughout winter, and the Blitz wouldn't truly end until May 1941. But the decisive phase had ended. Germany had failed to achieve air superiority, and Britain had survived. The final statistics tell the story. The Luftwaffe lost 1,777 aircraft destroyed during the battle period. Fighter Command lost 1,044 aircraft destroyed, but Britain built 2,247 new fighters during the same period, ending the battle stronger than it began. Germany built 900 fighters and ended the battle weaker. 544 RAF pilots died during the battle. The Germans lost approximately 2,650 aircrew killed, captured, or missing. The kill ratio favored Britain in both aircraft and personnel. More significantly, Britain's aircraft industry was undamaged and producing more fighters monthly than Germany. Britain's pilot training program was delivering trained pilots faster than losses occurred. The tide had turned permanently in Britain's favor. In November 1940, Hermann Göring quietly admitted failure to his staff. "The British fighter force is stronger today than in August," he told senior Luftwaffe officers. "We have not achieved our objectives. The invasion cannot proceed." Hitler turned his attention eastward, beginning planning for the invasion of the Soviet Union. Operation Sea Lion was officially postponed indefinitely, though Hitler refused to formally cancel it. The reality was clear to everyone. Britain would not be invaded. The Luftwaffe had failed. In the decades after the war, surviving German pilots acknowledged that the Battle of Britain was unwinnable. Major Adolf Galland, who became general of the fighter arm later in the war, said in a 1973 interview, "We never had a chance. The logistics were against us. The geography was against us. We were attacking an integrated defense system with fighters that had limited range and fuel. Even if we'd shot down every RAF fighter, Britain would have built more faster than we could destroy them. The battle was lost before it began." British veterans were more modest about their achievement. Wing Commander Tom Neal, reflecting on the battle in his 90s, said simply, "We did what we had to do. Britain needed defending, so we defended it. We were ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances. We didn't think about being heroes. We just flew and fought and tried to survive. That combination of determination, industrial capacity, and tactical skill saved Britain in its darkest hour." The few young men who climbed into Spitfires and Hurricanes throughout summer and autumn 1940 stood between Nazi tyranny and British freedom. They paid a terrible price. 544 died. Many more were wounded or scarred for life. But they won. Against numerical odds, against an enemy with more combat experience, against the same Luftwaffe that had swept aside every opponent it had faced, they won. The skies over Britain became a graveyard for German ambitions, and the tide of war began slowly turning toward ultimate Allied victory. Hermann Göring had promised Hitler that Britain would be bombed into submission within weeks. Instead, the Royal Air Force made those weeks into months of German defeat. The Luftwaffe that attacked Britain in July 1940 was a confident, experienced, seemingly invincible force. The Luftwaffe that limped away in October was a battered shadow. Its losses never fully recovered, its confidence shattered. Germany thought it could bomb Britain into submission. Instead, RAF Fighter Command, supported by ground crews, radar operators, factory workers, and an entire nation refusing to yield, transformed the skies into a killing ground where German certainty went to die. The Battle of Britain stands as proof that courage combined with industrial capacity and strategic wisdom can defeat even the most fearsome enemy. The memorial at Capelle Le Ferne overlooks the English Channel where so much of the battle was fought. The statue depicts a seated pilot, exhausted, looking toward France. The inscription reads, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." Visitors stand at that memorial and look across the water toward the French coast 21 miles away and understand what those few saved. The debt owed to the few can never be fully repaid. They saved not just Britain, but the possibility of freedom for all of Europe. Their sacrifice bought time for America to arm, for the Soviet Union to mobilize, for the alliance that would eventually crush Nazi Germany. Everything that followed, every Allied victory from El Alamein to Normandy to Berlin, was possible only because a few thousand young men refused to let Britain fall in 1940. Their legacy endures in every Spitfire that still flies, every Battle of Britain memorial, every September 15th when the nation pauses to remember. The annual ceremony at Westminster Abbey brings together the surviving few, their numbers dwindling each year. The last veteran of the battle died in 2020, but their story lives on. Squadron leader Jeffrey Wellham, one of the youngest pilots to fight in the battle at age 18, wrote in his memoir decades later, "We were just boys, really. Boys given machines and told to save the country. We didn't think we were special. We just did our jobs. If that saved Britain, then we're glad. But we were just ordinary people in extraordinary times." That modesty characterized the few throughout their lives. They insisted they weren't heroes, just men doing their duty. But Britain knew better. The nation understood that those ordinary men had achieved something extraordinary. They had faced the strongest air force in the world and defeated it. They had stood alone against Nazi Germany and survived. They had turned the skies over England into a graveyard for German dreams of conquest. The final word belongs to Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding, the quiet genius who built Fighter Command and led it to victory. In a speech after the war, he said simply, "I cannot speak highly enough of the fighter pilots. They were magnificent. They saved Britain when Britain needed saving most. History will remember their courage. I will remember their sacrifice." History does remember. Every year on Battle of Britain Sunday, the closest Sunday to September 15th, services are held across Britain commemorating the victory. The Royal Air Force flies Spitfire and Hurricane aircraft in formation over London. Veterans now all gone were honored at these services. Their families continue the tradition, ensuring that future generations understand what was won in the skies over Britain in 1940. The Battle of Britain was Britain's finest hour. A small island nation standing alone defeated the most powerful military force on earth through courage, determination, and industrial might. The few who flew and fought and often died in those desperate months of 1940 saved not just Britain, but the hope of freedom for all humanity. They proved that democracy could defeat tyranny, that free people could outfight and outproduce dictatorships, that Britain would never surrender. Their story reminds us that freedom is never free. It must be defended by every generation. The cost is high, measured in young lives cut short, in suffering and sacrifice. But the alternative, surrender to tyranny, is unthinkable. The few understood this. They paid the price willingly. Britain owes them everything. The world owes them everything. We shall remember them. Al.